Hey math kids, today we're going to talk about algebra with trig functions, and just a reminder, when we have x's, 3x plus 4x equals 7x, and if we had x minus 3x, we would get negative 2x. Now you should be able to do that, you should feel comfortable with that, and if you do, these work exactly the same way. So if we have 3 cosine theta, 4 cosine theta, that's just 7 cosine theta. And if we have tangent alpha, or like 1 tangent alpha minus 3 tangent alpha, that's going to be negative 2 tangent alpha. Okay? Now, on this next part, we're going to have to use some angle relationships. These are found on your cheat sheet that you can use on the IB test, or you can choose to memorize them if you want to. Okay, first thing is we have to use a relationship that says sine of negative theta is equal to negative sine theta. And so I'm going to replace this with this, and we get negative sine theta plus 2 sine theta. And once we see that, we have negative 1 plus 2 is just 1, so we just have a single sine theta. Okay, the next thing we want to do is cosine pi halves minus theta over cosine pi minus theta. Now, if we look at those relationships on our sheet, we can see that, let's see, the top one, cosine pi halves minus theta is equal to sine theta. And the bottom one, cosine of pi minus theta, is equal to negative cosine theta. So, if I replace this and this, I get sine theta. Then if I replace this and this, I get negative cosine theta. And then we have another relationship that sine theta over cosine theta is equal to tangent. And so if we do that, we still have a negative left over, so it's just negative tangent theta. Okay. Now, we're going to keep moving on using some of these relationships. So we have negative 2 minus 2 sine squared theta. Alright, so for this one, what we're going to do first, we're going to factor out a 2, and then we're going to look for this relationship. Well, we have something called the Pythagorean identity, so it's sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta is equal to 1. And if we do just a little bit of algebra on this, if I subtract sine squared theta, we can see that cosine squared theta is equal to 1 minus sine squared theta. So I'm going to replace this with that. We get 2 cosine squared theta. Okay. Now the next one is cosine squared theta sine theta plus sine cubed theta. So what these have in common, we have a sine and a sine. So if we factor out a sine, right here we're left with cosine squared theta. If we factor out a sine here, we're left with sine squared theta. If we go back up here to the Pythagorean identity, we see that sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta is just 1. So I can replace that with a 1. And so sine theta times 1 is just sine theta. Okay? Now this says to expand and simplify. So we have cosine minus sine, and that quantity is squared. So the first thing we want to do is write it a little bit different so we don't make a mistake. So when we square something, we're multiplying something by itself. If we multiply those two together, we get cosine squared theta. If we multiply these two together, we get negative sine cosine. If we multiply these two together, we get the same thing. And if we multiply these together, we get positive sine squared theta. Alright, the Pythagorean identity, remember, is sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And we can write that as sine squared from here plus cosine squared from here. And then we can also combine these. Negative 2 sine cosine. Put my thetas in there. This thing is just equal to 1. So it's going to be 1 minus 2 sine theta cosine theta. And I think that's all we can do with that. Okay, keep going. Alright, we got cosine squared alpha minus sine squared alpha. Okay. What we're going to do here, let me just remind you, if we have like x squared minus y squared and we're factoring it, we can do x plus y, x minus y. It's called difference of squares. Difference of squares. So that's what we're going to do here. So we're just going to do cosine alpha plus sine alpha. And then we're going to do cosine alpha minus sine alpha. Okay? So the directions were to factorize. Okay, on this next one, we have tangent squared theta minus 3 tangent theta plus 2. Now, this is kind of hard for some kids to see, but we have something squared, then just that something, and then a constant. So it's actually following ax squared plus bx plus c. So it's following like a quadratic pattern. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to say u is equal to tangent. And then I'm going to replace everything because it's going to help us see that. So it's going to be u squared minus 3u plus 2. Now it looks a little bit easier. So we can just do t factoring. These are both negative. U minus 1, u minus 2. And then I'm just going to replace those u's with tangents. Now if you feel like you can see it without doing the u substitution, go for it. But I think for a lot of kids it makes it easier if we actually substitute it. Okay, now we're going to do 2 minus 2 cosine squared theta over 1 plus cosine theta. Okay, what we need to do is expand and factor, and this is kind of combining everything we've been doing on this video. So the top, it's going to be 2, we're going to factor out of 2, and that's 1 minus cosine squared theta. Okay. Now, the bottom, we're just going to keep as 1 plus cosine theta. Now the top, because 1 can be seen as 1 squared, we can use the difference of squares method. And that's where we do 1 plus cosine theta, 1 minus cosine theta. Now there's implied parentheses on the bottom. That might make it a little bit easier to see that those two can cancel. And then we're just left with 2, 1 minus cosine theta. Okay, if you want, this is where the book stops, but I actually think it's a little more simple if we distribute that one more time. So I would end there. If you end where I wrote it in red, that's fine as well. And then we have one more. We have cosine theta minus sine theta, cosine squared theta, and sine squared theta. Okay, now the bottom we can factor using difference of squares again. So it's cosine plus sine times cosine minus sine. We still have cosine minus sine. There's implied parentheses up there. That cancels, that cancels. And so we have to leave a 1 on top because everything went away. And this is our final answer. If you need additional help, please come to Math Lab. Until then, calculator.